Good morning, everyone. I am bummed that I'm not with you. Many of you know that I am with the Rush family, celebrating, officiating the wedding of David Rush and Valentine. And so I wish I could be with you. I know this is not everyone's favorite way to hear a sermon, but I hope you hear in this effort my love for unpacking the Sermon on the Mount together and wrestling with it, and my desire to just keep working at it with you. And so I didn't want to miss a week, even though I can't be there with you. Let's get started with a question. When you think of a radical, what comes to mind? Just consider that for a second. Because typically, we think of an extremist of some kind, right? Like, to be radical is to go above and beyond everyone else. To be radical is to push the boundaries of what is acceptable. We think of radicals as those who are willing to do what others won't do or can't do. When we talk about politics, the radicals are those with the most extreme views. There are radicals on the left and there are radicals on the right. Ordinary citizens vote, but radicals protest. But then among the protesters, right, there are the ordinary sign-holding, chant-repeating kind. But then there are the radical protesters, and those are the ones who then use violence or force. Radicals break the law. Radicals transgress social norms. Radicals are extreme in their commitment. This is how we use the word radical in our context. And so it's really interesting how often Christians use the word radical to talk about Jesus or our faith, and it's interesting to think about what we mean by that. David Platt has a book called Radical. Greg Stier wrote a book called Radical Like Jesus. Champ Thornton wrote the Radical Book for Kids, and then because that book apparently wasn't radical enough, Thornton followed it up with the Really Radical Book for Kids. Hemsworth Jonas wrote Radical Discipleship. Shane Claiborne wrote The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical. There's a book called Radical Remnant, Radical Faith, Radical Generosity, Radical Christianity, and the Radical Gospel. Oh, and don't forget the Radical Prophet, Radical Welcome. The Gospel Comes with a House Key, Practicing Radically Ordinary Hospitality in a Post-Christian World. That one's a mouthful. And the Radical Cross. Seriously, I'm just scraping the surface of Christian books with radical in the title. Christians love some good radical talk. And when we use this word, we are often emphasizing the extreme nature of Jesus and the Christian faith. Writers, preachers, motivators who want to see the church stirred up to action will emphasize Jesus the radical. But what if I told you the word radical has nothing to do with rule breaking or boundary crossing or any kind of extreme devotion at all? What if I told you that Jesus was a radical? Jesus is a radical, but not at all in the way that we typically define that word. Is it possible that we have confused the Christian faith because we're confused about a word like radical? We're confused between what Jesus was doing and what it looks like he was doing. Like the man who is busy evaluating a yard to install some sprinklers. And so he's looking around and he's assessing everything. But he was stopped and questioned by the police because some neighbors saw what he was doing and thought he was casing the house in order to rob it. Right? The man was doing one thing, and he was seen doing that thing, but those who saw him misinterpreted his actions, and they thought he was doing something else. What Jesus was doing and what it sometimes looks like he was doing are not necessarily the same thing. But we are not the first to be confused by Jesus. Jesus, right here in Matthew 5:17-20, the passage we just heard read, appears to be correcting some of the confusion of those around him in his day. Yes, Jesus broke some of the spiritual rules that those during his day were following. He healed on the Sabbath. He, a human, forgave the sins of a paralyzed man. He and his disciples plucked grain and ate it on the Sabbath. He refused to condemn a woman caught in adultery. Jesus also broke all kinds of social conventions, right? He ate with sinners. He ate in the homes of tax collectors. He elevated the status of women. He surrounded himself with the weak and the unimportant, the ignored and the outcast. He criticized the wealthy and the powerful people of their day to their faces. It would be easy to see all of this behavior and call it extreme, to call it radical, because of how extreme Jesus was being. And because Jesus goes beyond what anyone else was doing, it's easy to go, that's extreme, that's radical. But is Jesus radical? And if so, in what way is he radical? Would you just nerd out with me for 1 second and do a quick little English word study? Do you know where the word radical comes from? The Latin word radix. R-A-D-I-X. Radix. The same Latin word from which we get the English word radish. The Latin word radix means root. Root. A radish is a root vegetable. Called this because the part of the food that we eat is actually the underground root part. When you eat a radish, you're eating a root. And a radical person, right, is a person who pursues the root of a matter, who lives according to a thing's root. What we mean when we call Jesus a radical is not that Jesus is some sort of extremist, right? Jesus hasn't set out to be extreme. He's not trying to be the most hardcore or committed in any particular way. He's not trying to be transgressive by eating with the wrong kinds of people. He's not setting out to break the rules and say, look, I'm breaking the rules. Jesus is deeply rooted in the love and the will of his Father. Which means Jesus is only ever concerned with living from his roots. Another way to say this is that Jesus is singularly devoted to the heart of his Father. That is what he's obsessed with. The only thing Jesus is ever concerned with is getting to the root, getting beneath the surface to the core. If it looks like Jesus is extreme at any given moment, It's not because Jesus is trying to be extreme. It's because the hearts of the people around him, the will of the people, is so far away from God's heart, from the roots. They are living such extreme lives that Jesus, resting in the love and will of God, living as a fully alive human, he looks extreme in comparison to this whole world of people whose lives are truly extreme. Jesus is seen as extreme when he says it is impossible for a rich man, a rich person, to get into the kingdom of heaven, to enter the kingdom of heaven. But what if? What if Jesus is radical, but he isn't the extreme one? Right? What if the unrelenting accumulation of wealth, the gathering of more and more stuff, what if that is such a gross perversion of what it means to live in God's good world, that the rich are the extremists? And what if Jesus, who lives day to day by the provision of his Father, what if Jesus is the radical who rests in the promises of God? A God who promises that there is more than enough for everyone. And so there's no need to hoard for tomorrow. When the accumulation of wealth becomes the dream, when getting rich is seen as the goal or the norm, Jesus, who has no interest in any of that, is going to be seen as extreme when he's really just a radical, rooted in his Father's love and will. I want this morning to remind us of a familiar story. And I want to use this story to help us see what Jesus is doing when he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Most of you know the story of Martin Luther King Jr. He was one of the primary leaders of the nonviolent protest movement taking place during the 1950s and 60s fight for civil rights. Many of you would recognize some of the famous lines from his most famous speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech. You might not know that those most famous lines were actually ad-libbed on the day and were not in his original transcript. But this morning, I want to focus just for a few minutes on the part of the speech that King wrote down in advance, the very beginning of the speech, because it's fascinating. King actually starts in the familiar style of Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. 50 years ago, King announces. And then King talks about the man who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the man who announced freedom for millions of black slaves, Abraham Lincoln. But King begins to lament that it is now 100 years later, and those black slaves are still not free. King laments the black lives still suffering because of segregation, discrimination, and brutal poverty. But let me pause there for just a second, because I want to point out that King was called a radical. He was called a radical because his message was seen, it was heard as too extreme. Most Americans during that day did not view King favorably at all, in part because of his radical actions, right? Radical meaning extreme. With that in mind, I want you to listen to King's words, and I want you to tell me what kind of radical he was. He goes on, he says, when the architects of our republic, right? The king is referring to the founders of our country, guys like Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison, Abigail Adams and Patrick Henry, right? The founders. When these guys wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, I just noticed what King says, how he describes this fundamental law of our land, of this nation. He says that this law that they wrote was magnificent, right? Great admiration for it. King goes on. They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today, King goes on, that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. King was accused of being a radical, of being extreme, because his words and his protests were seen as extreme. But King was a radical. And he wasn't even a little bit extreme. Right? King is making this bold claim in this speech. Segregation is the extreme, he says. Discrimination is the extreme. A whole race of people disproportionately held in abject poverty is the extreme. King, on the other hand, was a radical in the purest sense of the word, because he goes back to the roots. He goes back to the law of the founders. King, he goes back to the root and he reads their words and he takes them at face value. All men are created equal. That means something to him. This is the root foundation of our country, and that's where King was determined to live. But he didn't stop there. King then went to one of America's greatest prophets, Abraham Lincoln. And when I call him a prophet, I don't mean prophet as in like God's mouthpiece, that kind of way. When you read the biblical prophets, you notice that the thing that they keep doing, their core job, is to call Israel, the people of God, back to the law of Moses, back to faithfulness, to the promises of God. The prophets call people back to the roots of the faith. And that's exactly what Abraham Lincoln was doing. Lincoln was calling our country at the end of the Civil War, or during the Civil War, back to our founding promises. The Emancipation Proclamation was an announcement that promises in the Declaration of Independence were now available for everyone. King wasn't trying to be extreme. Right? He wasn't trying to break America or make a new America. He was announcing the truth that America had lost its way. It had forgotten its roots. And King was calling his country back to its promissory note. He wasn't trying to abolish the Constitution or the Emancipation Proclamation. King was working to fulfill their promises. Right? This is what made him a radical. He was committed to the root of America, no matter what it had become above the surface. Jesus is not calling you to go out and be extreme for him. He is inviting you to know our Father's heart and to do his will. There are times when that will look extreme. Not just to the world, but actually to those in the church who have lost their way. But being extreme for extreme's sake doesn't honor God. That's not what God is looking for. Doing the will of our Father is what honors God. Today, people on the political left and right will criticize you for not being angry enough about what's going on in our society. They want you to be extreme and to join them in their anger and hostility. But Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount invites us to stay rooted in our Father who is slow to anger. While our neighbors call their enemies names, we see in our enemies the image of God, women and men for whom Christ died. We would never speak disrespectful words of any of God's beautiful creations. At least that's what Jesus assumes the root to be. Today, we live in a world that is extreme in its pursuit of sexual gratification. Our neighbors are extreme in the way they define themselves primarily by their sexual desires. But Jesus invites us to put desire in its proper place. In the Sermon on the Mount, he is helping us see that our sexual desire is just one part of who we are. And he refuses to let us look at another person made in his image, right? Rooting us in the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2. He won't let us look at another person as some thing to be used or consumed to serve us or gratify us. Today, we live in a world that is extreme in its lack of commitment. It celebrates a kind of freedom that has no responsibility and no ties. Our neighbors go through marriages like seasonal styles. But in the Sermon on the Mount, we hear Jesus inviting us to see, to reflect on, to meditate on, to be rooted in our Father's ridiculous and relentless commitment to his unfaithful people. He wants our marriages to be visible evidence of his love and commitment. You can see how this works. Jesus doesn't simply read the law and the prophets, but he moves to their heart. He moves to God's heart revealed through them. This is what Jesus is doing. He sounds extreme. But if he's extreme, it's actually just evidence of how extreme our world has become in its rejection of him. Actually, if he sounds extreme today to us, to Christians, it might just be a sign that the church has defaulted on the promissory note from the law and the prophets and the Son of God himself. It should concern us how few Christians have any real place for Jesus in their parenting and in their politics, their marriages and their mortgages, their conflicts and their careers. Jesus is a true radical. He is committed to the root of the law and the prophets. What is the root of the law and the prophets? His Father's love and his Father's will. And he is committed to that love, and he is committed to doing the will of his Father. This is what it means for us if we are to take up the calling to be Christian radicals. It is to be committed to following Jesus and living out God's loving will, found in the law and the prophets. Maybe better to say, found beneath or behind the law and the prophets, but revealed in full for us through Jesus our Lord. And so the question for us today as we leave, as we continue in our worship, are you living out God's loving will? Are we living out God's loving will? I want to finish by praying for us, by praying for you. And I want to pray the Apostle Paul's words that he wrote, a prayer that he wrote for the church in Ephesus. I pray that we, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all of the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that we may be filled with all the fullness of God. Amen and amen. Grace and peace, my friends.